Beverly Hills 90210. The first primetime teen soap to be a big hit in the United States. Before there was Gossip Girl or The Vampire Diaries or Euphoria, there was Beverly Hills 90210. Released in 1990 on the Fox network, 90210 was a hit by the end of its first season. It was a success built 90s style, on mall appearances and magazine interviews, branded trapper keepers and bedsheets. It was everywhere. And up until a few months ago, I'd never seen an episode. Now, when 90210 began, I was a bit younger than the target demographic, and it was always more popular with girls than it was with boys, but that wasn't why I didn't watch it. Instead, it was one of the great many shows my parents wouldn't let me watch. I had a lot of different restrictions on pop culture growing up, and it tied back to my parents tending to get on board with whatever was the trendiest moral panic. I couldn't play Dungeons & Dragons because of the satanic panic. I couldn't watch The Simpsons because of backlash over Bart Simpson's poor work ethic. And 90210 I couldn't watch because of sexual content. My parents had a weird kind of duality when it came to sex. They were very forthright about the practical realities, but extremely restrictive about the cultural realities. Sex was not a thing to be discussed in public, and I was not allowed to watch any TV or movies that suggested people might have sex outside of marriage. This was less restrictive than you might imagine. A lot of TV from this time catered to these kinds of values. This is why Father Dowling Mysteries, a show about a crime-solving Catholic priest, could run in prime time back in the 90s, on Thursdays. But it did mean no Cheers or Friends or most of the other culturally defining shows from this time. For a long time I followed my parents' rules, contenting myself with Home Improvement or Star Trek The Next Generation or, yes, Father Dowling Mysteries. But my hunger for new, different TV ultimately led me to watch a lot of these prohibited shows behind their backs. Though by the time I started this fairly bland rebellion and reached an age where 90210 might have been interesting to me, the show was well into its decline, and there were plenty of mediocre comedies I could be watching instead. Why watch 90210 when I could be watching timeless classics like Caroline in the City?
On the next, Caroline in the City.
I'm Italian.
I spent the afternoon with a mobster's girlfriend, and she was naked.
But 90210 was a real boogeyman of the time, which meant it had a weird liminal existence in my consciousness. Even without watching it, I knew it was around because it was just out there in the ether. Both a sign of the scourge of immorality affecting television, as well as a thing my cooler, more mature classmates were always talking about. But I had no idea what it actually was, no idea what an episode would actually look like. I had seen dramas before, but with all the fear-mongering that accompanied 90210, my 9-year-old brain just sort of assumed the show exceeded my capacity to imagine it. Something I continued to believe somewhere in the back of my mind, until I finally got around to watching the show 3 decades after it premiered. To my surprise, I discovered it was just a normal teen soap, pretty much the same as any of the other teen soaps I've seen in the years since. More aimless, more earnest, lacking a lot of the little refinements that have become standard in the genre in the decades since, but pretty much the same. Certainly not the unimaginable eldritch horror I had been led to believe. It was extremely imaginable. 90210 may have been a trailblazer, but not because of its deft plots and smart characterization.
You promised a pot of gold, and I'm not going until I get it. Neither is anybody else.
Like most of the other teen dramas I've seen, it starts off pretty strong, taking a collection of obvious character tropes through a bunch of standard coming-of-age touchpoints, prom, high school graduation, etc. But as time goes on, the standard plots run out, and things become increasingly divorced from any kind of relatable reality. By season 6, it's a race to the bottom, as we find ourselves in a nonsensical cartoon populated by unlikable 20-somethings. But there was something I hadn't been expecting, a character unlike any I'd seen in other teen dramas. Donna Martin.
Oh, that's great. I'm Donna. I'm Donna, a freshman. Pretty confused freshman.
I'm Brenda, and this is Donna.
Hi. Hi. I'm number 675.
Donna Martin, played by Tori Spelling, was in 290 of the 292 total episodes of 90210. One of only 4 characters to span the entire 10-season run. Her character is the nice one, the Christian, the virgin. She's not the most important character on the show. Far from it, really. She's one of those second-level characters that lives her life as a perpetual B-plot. filling in the gaps between the stories you actually care about. She has romantic plots, but she only dates other secondary characters, and her non-romantic plots are, for the most part, pretty forgettable. And I found myself having the strange experience of being simultaneously bored and angry every time she sauntered into a scene. She'd just be hanging around, working at her clothing store and saying something inane, and I'd be irrationally frustrated. And she's so boring. She's so boring. The show could have had so many different kinds of characters, but instead it chose to weigh itself down with the lodestone that is Donna Martin. And I kept asking myself, what is she doing here? Why is she so boring? And why am I so upset about it? Now, there are some classic answers to two of these questions that anyone who was around in the 90s would probably be aware of, because Tori Spelling was the butt of many a joke. Why is she here? Well, she's here because of nepotism. She's the daughter of 90210 producer Aaron Spelling.
Tori Spelling is Amy Fisher in Aaron Spelling's Amy Fisher 10516.
Hi, Tori. What's up? Nothing. I just thought I'd butt into your scene. I can, because this is my daddy's show.
And this was obviously instrumental to her getting the part. And why is she boring? Well, she's boring because she's bad at acting.
Je suis American. And if you don't like it, then too bad. Bad temper? That's like saying Hurricane Andrew was a bad rainstorm.
And yes, both of these things are true, but they're also a little unfair. Yes, Tori Spelling got the job because of her dad. She freely admits that in interviews these days. But lots of people in Hollywood owe their success to nepotism, and the degree to which she was shamed about it back in the 90s was pretty unreasonable. And yes, she is bad at acting. But do you know who else is bad at acting? Lots of people on 90210. True, she's the worst, give or take a couple of recurring characters, but it's hard to get up on a high horse about Spelling's acting when you have Jason Priestley as number one on your call sheet. Spelling is pulling the average down, but not by as much as people at the time liked to pretend. So what was it about Donna? The standards of quality weren't that different back in the 90s. The writers must have known she was a terrible character, but they just kept doubling down, and I couldn't figure it out. Why was she like this? Why were her plots so boring? And why, amongst all these broadly drawn characters, did I find her in particular, so infuriating?
Here you go.
As much as I may want to dive right into talking about Donna, I'm going to need to take a step back and give a little bit more context on 90210. The origin of 90210 is an interesting collaboration between two different generations of TV hitmakers, one nearing the end of a storied career and the other right at the beginning. The older generation was represented by Aaron Spelling, Tori Spelling's father, and an old-school Hollywood heavyweight who was the producer of 90210. He produced Charlie's Angels, Dynasty, The Love Boat, and many other iconic shows. All this success left him enormously wealthy, and he lived exactly the kind of life you'd expect from a 70s era mogul. He remarried to a much younger woman and became known for throwing lavish parties in his 56,000 square foot mansion that he nicknamed The Manor. By 1990, he had been an industry force for a couple of decades, but his influence had begun to wane, and he hadn't had a big hit since the early 80s. The other player on this team was creator Darren Star. Star would become a hitmaker in his own right, responsible for creating shows like Melrose Place, Sex and the City, Younger, and Emily in Paris. But 90210 would be his first big success, and prior to that he hadn't done much of anything. His most prominent credit at the time was having written a film called Doin' Time on Planet Earth that was produced and distributed by Cannon Films. A fact that sounds less impressive the more you know about the coke-fueled bacchanal that was Cannon Films. His only other credit was as part of the production staff on low-budget slasher The Dorm That Dripped Blood, a film I felt compelled to watch for what should be obvious reasons. So this intergenerational duo of Spelling and Star took 90210 to the fledgling Fox network, which itself had only launched 4 years prior.
Change that can be arranged. Tell 'em now. It's on Fox.
At the time, Fox still didn't have much programming, offering its affiliates only primetime and late-night shows, and only for Fridays, Saturdays, and Sundays. 90210 was part of Fox's planned expansion into Thursday night. Despite the pedigree of its production, 90210 struggled in its initial season. When it premiered in October of 1990, it was panned by the critics, and suffered further from airing opposite Cheers, the #1 show of the time. The ratings were so-so, and the reviews were absolutely brutal. At that time, it was quite revolutionary to aim a show at high schoolers. Teenagers and young adults still watched the same shows as their parents, often with their parents. 90210 was prime time for young people, focusing on issues young people cared about in a very glamorous setting. Man, how the reviewers hated it. With all these issues, Fox didn't have much confidence in the future of the show, and even getting to the end of season 1 was a struggle. But Fox was a young network, and didn't actually have anything to replace 90210 with. So, with a bit of prodding from Aaron Spelling, they kept ordering more episodes. And by the end of season 1, ratings had started to improve. This didn't make 90210 one of the biggest shows on TV. It never actually cracked the top 20 shows for any of its 10 seasons. But it was never trying to appeal to everyone, and with its main demographic, teen girls, it was a massive hit.
You know, the research said that 70% of teenage girls watching television were watching Beverly Hills 90210.
Jason Priestley and Luke Perry, the two male leads, quickly became the heartthrobs of the moment.
Between his subtlety
and his
my
hair,
animal magnetism, and my Elvis,
his hair, the hair. He's got the hair. I don't hate.
Who's saying no to that?
The whole cast experienced a big jump in fame, but the Priestley versus Perry, good boy versus bad boy question became the defining question of the fandom. Priestley and Perry were fixtures of the teen magazines, so much so that Rolling Stone once described them as saving the teen fanzine industry from post-New Kids on the Block depression. A sentence that makes perfect sense to me, but must be nearly incomprehensible to anyone even a couple of years younger. By the standards of the 90s, the fandom got pretty out of control. Every cast member seems to have some crazy story about needing to flee an appearance. In what seems to be the most extreme example, a mall in Florida lost control of a crowd of 10,000 people that showed up to see Luke Perry. There was a brief stampede as people rushed the stage, and 21 people were hospitalized. After that, the actors stopped doing mall appearances. So, to Fox's surprise, they suddenly had an era-defining hit built on an audience mostly made up of teenage girls. And the network set about cashing in, creating as much merch as the market would bear. It's a little hard, 30 years removed, to get a good sense of just how much merch there was and just how much money was made from it, but suffice to say it was a lot.
Did you see what Brandon was wearing? Yeah, I helped him put it on. What? Cool! It looks just like on the show.
Ultimately, the show would run for 10 years, starting in October of 1990 and ending in May of 2000, spanning nearly the entire length of the 90s and setting off a wave of imitation teen dramas, hoping to replicate the success of these kids from Beverly Hills.
Don't sell a dream, you should be keeping pure and simple every time.
It's a bit challenging to talk about 90210 in the modern environment because expectations for television have changed so much. 90210 exists at this transitional time in the history of the medium, and that comes out in different ways when you watch the show. What I watched when I made my way through 90210 was not the same show that people watched when it was first out. The most obvious difference is that a lot of 90210 content is either different or hard to find or just missing, owing largely to music rights issues. Music licensing deals for TV were different back in the 90s, and often only took into account a show's initial run and eventual syndication, because that's all there really was. So, in many instances, the music that was used in 90210 didn't have deals that covered DVDs or streaming. And when you watch it now, it's been replaced with all this weird, fake studio music. It can be pretty distracting.
So what was that thing you were doing over here?
What the hell is this?
Nice. There are also a number of episodes where music is really important to the plot, or a popular musician shows up and plays a song.
Dream on, dream away.
And rather than pay for the music rights, the episodes are just gone, and if you want to watch them, you have to deal with some less reputable parts of the internet. This can be pretty confusing when you're streaming, because you'll just be watching episodes, letting them autoplay, and something like this will happen.
They
can't have a baby right now.
I know.
Brandon, talk to me.
Hey, babe, we're at the hospital now. Everything's gonna be okay. You're gonna be okay.
This was a truly shocking development, and I was justifiably stunned. But something seemed off about it. Most notably that there was one person hanging out with everybody at the hospital that I'd never seen before. And I was like, who's that guy? What is he doing here? So I went and checked the episode list, and it turned out I had missed 4 episodes, including the 2-part season 7 finale and the season 8 premiere. Kelly had lost the baby 3 episodes ago, and this was an entirely unrelated stomach trauma. Now, I found ways to watch all these missing episodes, but it wasn't always easy. The more subtle difference in watching 90210 now versus when it first came out is in how story functions in shows from this time and how that relates to expectations about how the show was going to be consumed. Unlike later entrants into the teen soap genre, 90210 doesn't have some central conflict around which the show revolves. There's no hellmouth to close, no gossip girl to uncover. It's just a group of teens dealing with life and growing up in Beverly Hills, California. This may not sound particularly notable, but having them grow up at all was fairly daring for the time. TV from this era has a certain timelessness, and any change to the status quo was met with a lot of hand-wringing. Maybe you have a show where 2 characters start to date after seasons of flirting.
Bitch.
Bastard.
And it would set off all this debate about whether or not it ruined the show. Changing the structure of your show was a risk. The whole thing might collapse. Allowing the kids of 90210 to grow up meant building status quo changes into the show. Aaron Spelling actually had to be convinced to let the characters get older, and it took a while to convince him, which is why the characters spend both the first and second seasons as juniors in high school. Ultimately, you end up with this half measure in 90210, where time exists and things happen, but not in a way that fundamentally alters the structure of the show. After a while, it feels like you're moving around in this state of semi-amnesia, where things keep happening, but then just cease to exist 10 episodes later. And the longer the show goes on, the worse it gets, as characters are just buried under an avalanche of improbable events that have no lasting impact. You'll be watching Kelly, who, over the course of a couple seasons, will get trapped in a house fire, join a cult, develop a drug addiction, have their boyfriend go to jail, take in a teen runaway, then get kidnapped by that runaway. Then she'll casually mention that she's nervous about finals, and you're like, she's still in college? And your sense of time just shatters. I think this is a product of the way the TV was expected to be consumed in the time leading up to the 90s. You could watch a show on TV when it came out, or you could hope to catch it in reruns, and that was pretty much it. Videotapes could only hold 2 or 3 episodes of an hour-long drama, meaning you'd need a dozen tapes to hold a season. This made shows expensive to own and impractical for video rental stores to stock. DVDs weren't a widespread technology yet, and streaming was a couple of decades away. So TV writers had to be careful with how much things changed in their shows. People are going to miss some episodes, and you don't want to make it hard for them to come back. In this kind of viewing environment, a consistent structure makes engaging with the show a lot easier. All this is to say that when I sit down and watch 90210, I'm not watching it the way it was meant to be watched. I should be watching 1 episode a week over the course of 10 years in situations where I can't realistically go back and catch up on anything I missed. This creates a kind of viewing that has a perpetual present, where the time occurring for the viewer and the time occurring in the show are expected to run in parallel. How much time has passed between the episode you watched last week and this week? 1 week. How much time passed in that 2-month hiatus? 2 months. Modern shows are careful to mark time because they assume people will watch them in a variety of contexts. But 90210 doesn't bother with any of that, because it's relying on the viewer's lived experience to mark that time. Kelly's journey from house fire to cult to drug addiction to being kidnapped by a teen runaway feels a lot less overwhelming if I'm watching it over 2 real years as opposed to feverishly binging it in a week. The real time between episodes makes the plot less surreal, and it gives the viewer time to forget. When Steve and Janet's baby is born prematurely in season 10, I shouldn't remember that Andrea and Jesse's baby was born prematurely in season 4. I shouldn't remember that Steve was there, helping out. That would have been 5 episodes airing 6 years ago. Plots are supposed to melt away. The show expects me to forget, which makes story a lot less important overall. You can't really talk about the plot of 90210 because there isn't one. Instead, we need to talk about 90210 as a structure. A machine made up of characters that never change. And understanding 90210 starts with understanding those characters and how they work. Alright then. Now that we're relaxed.
I know who I am. Brandon Walsh, a regular kind of guy from Minnesota. Nothing's gonna change that at all.
Played by Jason Priestley, Brandon Walsh is the son of Jim and Cindy Walsh, twin brother of Brenda Walsh, but this isn't all that important. What actually matters is that he's the show's good boy, its moral center. He spends most of his time strolling around the show, passing judgment as he looks down from his mansion on the moral high ground. And his version of morality is just a milquetoast enlightened centrism. Predictably, being the moral center of the show, Brandon is pretty insufferable. He's just a good boy trying to be as good as possible, which rarely makes for compelling television. It also shouldn't come as too much of a surprise that our white heterosexual male from the Midwest with moderate values is positioned as a natural leader. You can tell he's a natural leader not just because the show tells you that he is.
Can't you accept the fact that you're a born leader with the brain and intellect to make a difference in this world?
But also because he keeps being handed authority for inexplicable reasons. Forget about Andrea, who works really hard to assume positions of leadership. The person we really need is someone who isn't doing much of anything.
I was thinking that he has a chance to be a real star, but he needs a swift kick in the butt. And since you've done it for the last 2 years, I was thinking we make him the next editor-in-chief.
The writers really want to walk this tightrope where part of Brandon's claim to leadership is that he's too humble to seek it out. Obviously, this is a pretty naive fantasy about leaders, but I love that the writers try and make it work because it means they have to keep finding ways for Brandon to accidentally end up in leadership positions. Want to see how Brandon becomes student body president of his college? And now Brandon's president. I guess I should give a bit more explanation. Brandon is convinced to be the VP candidate when this bit character runs for president. They run an insurgent campaign and end up triumphing, largely on the strength of a speech Brandon gives. Then this.
You want to take a ride or something?
In your car?
I'll be back in 20 minutes.
We finished counting the votes. You won.
After 8 seasons of standing up for the status quo, Brandon just kind of wanders off the show early in season 9 and is replaced with Matt Durning. And I really mean replaced. Matt is pretty much just Brandon, but a lawyer. And this is pretty typical of 90210. Because the characters are just a structure used to generate plot, when important load-bearing people leave, new people need to be slotted into their place. This is never more apparent than with
If you want to punish me, then you punish me. But don't blame Dylan. It's not his fault. In fact, until we got to Baja, Dylan didn't even know that
That you lied to us?
Played by Shannon Doherty, Brenda Walsh is the show's bad girl. Jim and Cindy's daughter, Brandon's twin sister. She spends her time on the show getting into fights with her dad and having a tumultuous relationship with the show's bad boy. The function of the bad girl is to create conflict by doing bad things, then create more conflict when they get found out, then go through redemption arcs, over and over again. On-set drama led to Doherty's exit after season 4, which, despite being big news at the time, I was only aware of because she was replaced by Saved by the Bell alum Tiffany Thiessen. I loved Saved by the Bell growing up. It ran on 3 different channels in my area, which meant on weekdays I could string together a totally healthy 2.5 hours of viewing. On 90210, Thiessen played Valerie Malone, and since this was the first big character replacement, the writers went out of their way to make sure everybody understood she was there to do the same job as Brenda. It's not Brenda, but it's Brenda's childhood friend who looks a bit like Brenda, moves into Brenda's old room, immediately starts dating Brenda's ex, and assumes the mantle of the bad girl. The only big difference between Brenda and Valerie is that Valerie's not related to Brandon, a fact with implications the show really wants you to be aware of. Her whole first episode, the writers have her keep walking into Brandon's room half naked, just to make sure you really get it.
Sorry, I thought we were like family now.
Well, we are, but...
Brandon, it's okay. I get it.
See, she's like Brenda, but Brandon can have sex with her.
Hey, Brandon. You want some?
A few seasons later, Valerie is swapped out for Gina Kincaid, and the cycle repeats itself all over again. Except I don't think Gina ever lives in Brenda's room. I'm not sure, though, she might. A lot of those later episodes fell out of my memory the second the closing credits hit. All 3 bad girl characters are used as conflict engines, with most of the conflict coming from their making selfish decisions. Doherty's strength as an actress keeps Brenda relatively grounded, but once she leaves, character nuance mostly goes with her. Valerie and Gina are both just duplicitous sex pots, using people for money and constantly trying to reform the bad boy in order to fill the void in their lives left by absent or abusive fathers. It's not great, but it's at least entertaining, which is more than I can say for some characters.
Will that be all?
Just one more thing.
What?
You?
Dylan.
Ow.
I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. Don't stop.
Played by the late Luke Perry, Dylan is the show's bad boy. Deep, tortured, rich, angry at his dad. It's a James Dean knockoff for people who like their bad boys to come with financial stability. Dylan is there for the view, and the camera knows it. Perry gives a pretty hammy performance, but it's always enjoyable. Almost all of my favorite lines are said by Dylan.
You know, Brent, only one person's ever made me feel that bad. He's in jail now.
Put on a little Dylan.
Dylan is also a pretty bad person, which maybe shouldn't have surprised me as much as it did. He's the bad boy, sure, but I wasn't expecting him to be such a dick. He's dismissive of his friends and cruel to every woman he dates. He cheats, he ignores them, he seems like he's constantly on the cusp of violence. Given all the hype around Dylan from this time, I really expected him to have more redeeming qualities. He is nice to his eventual wife, but that relationship was founded on lies, and she dies in a hail of bullets immediately after they get married.
What the hell? Oh my God! Oh,
Put on a little Dylan.
Dylan exits the show in season 6 after his wife is gunned down. And then, after the boring debacle that is season 7, Noah Hunter is brought in as a replacement bad boy. Noah is kind of a disaster, though, basically a buff Dylan with no charisma, so the producers just bring Dylan back in season 9. Weirdly, they don't get rid of Noah, though, so he's just hanging around moping while Dylan is off doing plot. The point of the bad boy is pretty similar to that of the bad girl, but rather than creating interpersonal conflict, he self-destructs and needs to be saved by his friends. He's presented as a tragic figure, desperate for love but unable to trust, and much more sympathetic than any of the bad girl characters. But I just can't get over how awful he is. Like, sure, his dad is blown up by the mob. But we all have problems, Dylan. Try and get it together.
And now, West Beverly's choice for most beautiful. And the winner is the one and the only. There she is, Kelly Taylor.
Congratulations. Go.
Played by Jenny Garth, Kelly Taylor is the hot girl. Obviously, everyone on this show is gorgeous, but Kelly's primary role seems to be being desired.
Kelly Taylor, girl who has everything. Great body, great clothes, and a really great body.
I said stop staring at me.
I'm gonna go to the bathroom.
I'd give anything to be a fly on the wall of that bathroom.
Her plots constantly revolve around her looks as they lead alternately to her success or far more often her suffering. Sometimes this means getting an eating disorder or stressing over the scars left from that pesky house fire, but usually it means getting hurt by men. It doesn't matter if she's joining a cult, working at a nonprofit, or just being trapped in a burning building, someone is going to try and harass, stalk, or assault her.
How did you know where I live?
I hope you don't mind. I followed you home.
Beyond this, Kelly has one of the more plastic characters on the show. Her personality is rewritten to serve whatever the plot needs her to do or whoever it needs her to date. Never is this clearer than when, in order to set up a new love triangle, the writers just erase her personality entirely with that classic soap opera standby, amnesia.
I don't know if I want to remember.
Kelly stays on for the entire show, and after Brandon leaves, she kind of becomes the new moral center. But the show is so fully off the rails at this point that it never really comes together.
I haven't slept in days. I've been literally so anxious, I could feel my heart racing in my chest. I get sick when I think about what Jody's doing to me.
She's only asking for your help if it's your child.
Is that supposed to make me feel better? Is it? Because it doesn't.
If you wanna be happy for the rest of your life, never make a friendship with your wife.
Played by Ian Ziering, Steve Sanders is Brandon's best friend and fits a character trope I like to refer to as the scumbag friend. This is an unfortunately common setup where the main character is a generic nice guy who hangs out with a predatory monster used for comic relief. Think Barney from How I Met Your Mother, or Howard from The Big Bang Theory. That's Steve Sanders, except Steve is worse, because he's explicitly a rapist.
Believe me, she was into it.
Also a racist.
You mean like that whole jungle fever thing?
Also homophobic.
He makes one move on me, one gesture, one look. He'll regret it.
But he does it all with an impish smile, so you know it's not that big a deal. Steve's character is a good example of how the structure of the show, these static character types, organizes political difference. In the 90s, with more limited options, it often made sense to create content that featured a cross-section of humanity in order to appeal to as many people as possible. Different people can identify with different characters, and it creates natural conflict as characters react to events in different ways. Of course, while the show is purporting to represent a cross-section of society, what it's really doing is constructing a vision of the normal. A normal which is white, heterosexual, and cisgender.
I think it sucks because...
I think it sucks?
Yeah, they put too much bullshit in it, you know?
Yeah?
You know, they're all white, you know, in that show and everything. Maybe they had that one show with that black guy, but still, you know? They should put some more, you know, different nationalities into it. So what do you think, Nick?
Yeah, I haven't seen any Iranian guys in there or anything.
I don't even have no one comes to school in pearls and makeup. Nobody dresses like that. Nobody dresses like that.
Black characters and gay characters appear, but almost exclusively as issues that our normal characters need to confront.
Don't you think you have some kind of, obligation to the gay community here?
Within this setup, Steve represents the rightward limit of acceptable discourse. Anytime the show wants to let you know that feminism has gone too far or that gender non-conforming people are gross, you can be sure it's Steve who will be our main character. Steve's main function on the show is to normalize and sanitize a pretty harmful version of politics, and more specifically of masculinity. His behavior is generally not presented as good and is frequently laughed at, but in the ethics of the show, Steve's behavior never makes him a bad person.
You're the best Steve you can be. You know what I'm saying?
You're damn right, Brandon.
He's always being called a good guy, and his loyalty to friends and family is always treated as sufficient to justify his horrific behavior. Steve is completely irredeemable, which is only made worse by the fact that the show doesn't seem to think there's any need to redeem him. Played by Gabrielle Carteris, Andrea Zuckerman is the brassy, opinionated, liberal woman. Andrea is generally positioned on the liberal side of most issues and serves a similar function to Steve in terms of organizing the political spectrum of the show. But where Steve's conservatism is presented as buffoonish and ignorant, her liberalism is presented as shrill and naive.
Look, what I think we need to focus on are the issues.
Valedictorian, editor of the student paper, political organizer. Naturally, her plot arc is to lust after Brandon for the first 3 seasons, get pregnant in season 4, have a hasty, unhappy marriage to minor character Jesse, and get cut from the show as soon as her contract is up in season 5. After that, the character is replaced every season or 2 with a new brassy woman whose main purpose is to have someone to date Steve. I lump Claire, Carly, and Janet into this group. Andrea never dates Steve, though they do make out at one point, but each successive version of the brassy woman does. I feel like this is another pretty common trope, where a horrible misogynist is paired up with a strong, independent woman to call them on their BS.
You like me because I'm a scoundrel.
I don't think that's a real thing, though, is it? I guess we could just call it a toxic relationship, and there are plenty of those. I think this kind of relationship is probably just a good way to generate plot, since you have endless opportunities for them to disagree and put their relationship in jeopardy. The characters tend to cycle in and out fast enough that there isn't much purpose to them beyond their dating Steve.
Oh, I'm sorry, you must be Christine. I'm David Silver. I'm sure he's mentioned me. Steve and I are close buds.
Don't push your luck, bud.
Are those autographs on your program?
Yeah, I just kind of snuck backstage.
How'd you get in?
Clean living, Steve-O.
Played by Brian Austin Green, David Silver is the nerd character. Sort of. It's a weird character. One that really lays bare how much the show froze the characters' personalities in high school. Making David the nerd is fine in season 1, but by season 10 you have this giant ripped musician looming over the rest of the cast, recovering from a meth addiction, directing music videos in his nightclub, talking about how nice nerdy guys just never get a fair shake.
Anybody out there qualify as the nice guy? You guys are losers.
After Kelly, David is probably the character with the most variety in his plots. His positioning as a nerd allows him to be constantly driven by a desire to prove himself. This makes it easy to justify a pretty wide variety of choices. David is basically the chief secondary character, captain of the B-plot, adding spice to the show without ever being the main attraction. They don't need to maintain him as a moral center like Brandon, or make sure he stays as sexy as possible like Dylan. He's also not objectively a monster like Steve. He's not a good person, but in a somewhat benign way. He cheats on girlfriends, gets addicted to drugs, goes into debt. Normal soap stuff. Forgivable stuff. Though his most common plots are either about him trying to make it in the entertainment industry or about dating Donna. He marries Donna in the final episode, which feels completely unearned. Like the culmination of nothing other than an abrupt shift the writers made when they found out the show wasn't going to be renewed and they wanted to put a bow on things.
Okay, girls, see you tomorrow.
Whoa, here it is. The moment of initiation. The passing of the tray.
And then, the usual night before. And then...
There are also adults in this show, but they don't really matter. They live their lives to offer words of wisdom to the children of 90210. Initially, this is Jim and Cindy Walsh, Brandon and Brenda's parents. They basically become the parents for the entire group of friends because it's cheaper than having guest stars. There's also Nat Pasiccio, the owner of the local diner where all the kids hang out, the Peach Pit. He acts as another role model for the kids, serving folksy humor alongside what must be phenomenally mediocre burgers. After contracts were up at the end of season 5, the Jim and Cindy Walsh characters were cut, with the in-universe story being that they moved to Hong Kong. Nat then gets promoted from recurring character to main cast and serves as the adult role model for all the kids from here on out. And that's all the characters. Okay, so as promised, it's time to talk about Donna. For a bit, then I'm going to stop talking about her again. And then I'll start talking about her again. It's the whole thing. On the one hand, Donna is the easiest character to talk about, and on the other, she's the hardest. What makes her easy to talk about is that Donna is the most one-dimensional character on the show. She's the saint. Calling her the good girl in the same way that I call Brandon the good boy would honestly be underselling it. She lacks flaws in a way that is comically exaggerated.
Donna Martin, an angel on earth if ever there was one.
Her characteristics are pretty limited beyond this. She has a learning disability, she likes fashion, and she's a virgin. Of these, it's her virginity that motivates the majority of her plots. Donna's stories tend to follow a very predictable set of events. Donna starts dating some guy, then the issue of her virginity comes up, at which point the guy either says that he's fine with it or the relationship ends.
I would never push you to do anything you didn't want to do, Donna.
If the guy says he's fine with it, he'll then typically cheat on Donna, though occasionally relationships will end for other reasons.
And it's over.
Don't do this, Donna, please. I'm begging you. Do not do this.
Acting! Brilliant!
There's so many plots with so many guys that go like this. David, Griffin, Ray, Joe, David, Cliff, David. It feels endless. There are a few plots that don't center on her virginity, but not many. She nearly gets prevented from attending high school graduation. She spends time in a beauty pageant. She opens a clothing store. There's a weird debutante thing. And that's all I can remember. That's less plot than some characters get in a single season. Donna is weirdly bereft of plot, despite being in nearly 300 episodes of the show. When she's not guarding her virtue, she's mostly just tagging along in other people's plots, particularly her boyfriends. She spends so much time as a side character in David's life. David needs to find his mom, well, Donna's gonna help. David has a drug addiction, well, Donna's there to comfort him. David is the school DJ, well, meet DJ Donna.
Listen, Donna, if you do come, you have to do me a favor and promise me you'll just blend in with the woodwork.
Okay, I promise. I won't say a word.
It reeks of not knowing what to do with the character. And this is the problem with making someone the saint. It's hard to drum up conflict for a character that never does anything wrong. What makes her character more complicated is something I didn't even notice until I started rewatching the show, when I realized that in the beginning, Donna's barely there at all. She's presented as part of the main cast, she's in the opening credits, but she's not really a character. She's set dressing, a glorified extra. In the entire first season, she only gets one actual plot, which is a B plot where they find out she has a learning disability. Up to that point, she had been loosely characterized as the dumb one.
Oh, how embarrassing. I am wearing both contacts on the same eye.
And it feels like they took that one bit of information and tried to make it into a plot. Almost as if someone told them they had to. Beyond that, there's no characterization at all. Something even the writers seem to joke about.
You know what your problem is, Donna?
What?
Your life is totally boring.
She's barely in the second season either. She starts dating David, she reveals she's a virgin, But that's pretty much it. Things finally start to pick up for Donna in season 3, and by season 5, she's a full-fledged secondary character. And this is the thing about the Donna character. It's not there in the beginning. All the other characters, every single one, starts with a large degree of definition. Brandon is insufferable.
Didn't your mother teach you about playing hard to get?
Steve is the worst.
It's a special program for minorities, Brandon, so we can all become more enriched and diverse.
Dylan is a sad little rich boy.
He just gets to me. He always gets to me.
But Donna is nothing. Across the 10 seasons of 90210, Donna is the only major character that the writers make up whole cloth as the show goes on. And this is the question with Donna. This is what makes her complicated. If they're going to make her up, why make her up this way? 90210 was a hit without her, so why go to all this trouble to transform a one-note, airheaded extra into a purveyor of repetitive virginity plots? As I've come to interpret Donna, I see her character development as one of several changes that were made to the show after it stormed onto the scene in season 1. Changes that were shaped by the show's initial reception. See, despite having low viewership in season 1, 90210 still managed to create a fair amount of controversy. The controversy centered on an episode called Spring Dance. As you might expect, Spring Dance follows our group of teens as they prepare for and then go to the Spring Dance. It has a bunch of different plots, but the one that caused problems was the Brenda and Dylan plot. At this point in the show, Brenda and Dylan have been dating for a few months, and Dylan has been pressuring Brenda for sex pretty much the entire time.
Brenda, we've been going out for 2 months now. I have been absolutely faithful to you, and all I get is a bunch of promises and a lot of I'm sorry.
Put on a little Dylan.
Brenda's super into Dylan and has been toying with the idea of sleeping with him, but despite a couple of near misses, it hasn't happened yet. With that background established, let's take a look at an abridged version of their plot in this episode.
Bren, this is your night. Actually, it's our night.
Dylan, I'm a little nervous. And it's not that I'm not ready, believe me, I am.
Don't you know? I love you.
Do you know why I'm so lucky? How many girls get to have sex for the first time with someone they love?
Brenda, you're glowing.
Yeah, well, you have a goofy grin all over your face, and you better wipe it off.
You didn't. You did.
That's everything that happened, and it caused an outcry.
So was there any fallout from that Spring Dance episode?
Oh, there's, a lot of fallout from the Spring Dance episode. It was right around the time the show started to take off, and I think Fox got a lot of complaints from their affiliates that they, were just sort of freaking out that this high school girl had sex with her boyfriend at the Spring Dance and enjoyed it, and there were no sort of repercussions.
Weirdly, I'm not even editing this down all that much. Brenda and Dylan having sex is not a major story in this episode. It's one of the C plots. The A plot is Steve is upset because he's adopted and Kelly forgot his birthday. There's not really a B plot, though maybe it's Kelly and Brenda fighting over a dress. I don't know. Then there are 5 C plots. Kelly and Brandon, will they, won't they? Andrea feeling hurt and resentful that she's not at the dance with Brandon. David wanting to dance with Kelly. Donna having an impractical dress. And Brenda and Dylan having sex. It's not a raunchy episode, and it doesn't really make that big a deal out of the sex. Sure, it happened, but the episode doesn't linger on it or make it into some momentous event. It's just one of several things that happened at a school dance. But this was the 90s, and the 90s was deep in a backlash against contemporary sexual attitudes.
The filth that you ushered into the homes, called family entertainment, derided the word of Almighty God, debased the values that we hold dear, promoting illicit sex, promoting nudity sprinkled with profanity that rolls out like a gutter of filth from the programs coming out of Hollywood and coming out of New York City.
At the same time that 90210 was rising in popularity, there was a significant push from conservative Christian groups to press their agenda more effectively in politics. It's a bit hard to imagine now, but there was a time when Christianity wasn't so exclusively associated with the right wing. But with Roe v. Wade in 1973, the Christian right began rising in influence, though it was still struggling to get much traction politically. That started to change in the late 80s as the Christian right reworked their methods and began to focus on the Republican Party. Much of this activism was run through the newly created Christian Coalition, founded by Pat Robertson after the dissolution of a similar group called the Moral Majority.
A vacuum does exist for an organization that enables Christians to affect politics. The vision of the Christian Coalition is to provide a means to give Christians a voice in their government once again.
Both of these are pretty bog-standard groups advancing a conservative political agenda under the guise of a return to traditional values. And it does not take long to see the impacts of these movements on the Republican political platform. All of a sudden, we have a new wave of politicians lamenting the collapse of the American family.
This effort is about the American family.
Defending the values of the family.
The breakdown of the family.
We've got a breakdown of the family.
We've had some collapse of the family.
The crisis in this country is a breakup of the family. And the media does nothing to help us there.
And remember that television was different at this time. Rather than being split off into hundreds of channels and dozens of streaming services, there were 3.5 major networks and everybody watched them. Television was much more of a shared social experience, more of a town square, which made it a convenient place to play out political battles. So we could have our president and vice president fighting a strange proxy battle against primetime television.
And we need a nation closer to the Waltons than the Simpsons.
It doesn't help matters when primetime TV has Murphy Brown, a character who supposedly epitomizes today's intelligent, highly paid professional woman, mocking the importance of fathers by bearing a child alone and calling it just another lifestyle choice.
How could we raise good kids if Bart Simpson is so rude? How could we prevent the LA riots if Murphy Brown has kids on her own? Yeah, that Dan Quayle speech is about the LA riots. It's a war fought in a simulacrum where representation supersedes reality. If we can change the stories we tell about society, we can change society. If we can replace the Simpsons with the Waltons, we can return to the fantasy of American life that the Waltons represents.
Daddy, where did you find me?
Hiding behind one of your mama's smiles, honey.
The backlash that 90210 faced after Spring Dance came out of this same moral panic. But rather than protesting unthinkable horrors like women having children on their own or children not respecting authority, the issue here was sex existing in proximity to teenagers.
Why is Hollywood afraid to promote the morality of abstinence? We're not asking too much.
It's actually a little startling to look back and realize just how much sex is in the first season of 90210. I didn't pay much attention my first time through because the plots aren't particularly notable from a modern perspective, but it was a lot for the time. Beyond just Brenda and Dylan having sex, Brandon also has sex with an ex from Minnesota, Steve and Kelly have a drunken hookup at a party, Brandon dates a classmate who has a kid, Kelly confesses that her first sexual experience was non-consensual, Cindy considers having an affair, Steve propositions a sex educator only to find out she has AIDS, and let's not forget about the incredibly awkward season finale where Andrea offers herself up to Brandon as a going-away present.
I've got a going away present for you.
Well, what is it?
Ta-da!
What? The carousel, the horse? What?
No, I'm giving you the person on my horse.
That is hard to watch. And there's more than what I'm describing, because even when the plots aren't about sex, characters are constantly talking about it, which makes sense because these are a bunch of teenagers. Also, while sex is around, it isn't salacious or idealized. And 90210 can be pretty clever in the way that it engages with the reality of sex. Brenda doesn't just have sex with Dylan, She spends half a season thinking about it, and the show uses different plots to give her opportunities to think about and engage with the various possible consequences of having sex. Talking about pregnancy, talking about STIs, talking about sexual violence. When she and Dylan finally do have sex, there isn't much left to talk about, because the show spent the better part of a season having Brenda talk about it already. What's left to say at the spring dance? But for all the sex in this season, the backlash wasn't about Steve being a scumbag or Brandon having sex with an ex. It wasn't about Cindy considering infidelity or Kelly telling the story of her assault. It wasn't even really about Dylan and Brenda having sex. It was about Brenda having sex.
As a result of the firestorm that occurred when Brenda lost her virginity at prom without remorse, and that is the key part of it, without remorse, is that the Standard and Practice Division of Fox no longer remained an independent body. They became a division of sales.
They, were just sort of freaking out that this high school girl had sex with her boyfriend at the spring dance and enjoyed it, and there were no sort of repercussions. That led to an episode the next season where Brenda had a pregnancy scare. There was an idea that Brenda had to have consequences based on her having had sex with Dylan.
The affiliates were demanding their pound of flesh, and with Fox still an upstart network struggling to survive, it wasn't taking any risks. 90210 was going to need to make some changes. So Fox had a controversy that needed to be contained and a hit that needed to be protected. They needed to silence the critics without turning off the teens, and they weren't about to get stopped by petty concerns like believable characters. The first order of business was course-correcting Brenda, appeasing the critics by handing out a punishment for her having had sex. Luckily, the end of season 1 had a cliffhanger where Brenda's period was late.
I'm late.
What is she late for?
So the show leaned into that hard in season 2 with a pregnancy scare. What better way to punish Brenda than to have her worry about being pregnant after having had sex one time? After some panicking, Brenda finds out she's not actually pregnant. Yes. But it understandably freaks her out. What's less understandable is that she starts acting like she never considered any of the consequences of sex. Like she hadn't just spent the better part of a year discussing them with friends and family. In season 1, she makes Dylan get an AIDS test before she'll consider having sex with him.
Have you ever had sex when you weren't protected?
Not lately.
But all of a sudden in season 2, condoms are just too much.
It all feels too much right now, worrying about condoms and birth control pills and seeing a gynecologist and getting pregnant and what my parents are thinking.
And so she just dumps Dylan. This episode is written by Darren Star, and I'm sure he did his best to make it seem natural, but it's not. It only works if you forget about season 1. I don't really blame him for it though. His bosses told him he had to write the episode, so he did. Brenda needed to be punished, so she was. The affiliates got what they wanted. Sex destroyed her relationship.
Everybody talks about sex like it's no big deal. And it is a big deal.
Subtle. But in the end, it was never going to be enough to just punish Brenda. Maybe this stops the initial outcry, but what's to stop the next one? There needed to be a larger political shift in the show. And the first clue that something is up comes when Brenda confesses her possible pregnancy to Kelly and Donna.
Didn't you guys use protection? Of course, I'm not stupid. It's just that not everything's 100% effective.
Well, except,
what? Abstinence.
Cool. Thanks, Donna. This line hit me like a ton of bricks because it was something that I, and really anyone that came of age in the 90s, heard all the time.
The only thing that's 100% foolproof regarding pregnancy and STDs is abstinence.
A line developed in the bowels of right-wing think tanks and spread out across every youth group in America. A line meant to sell abstinence-only sex education.
We will double federal funding for abstinence programs so schools can teach this fact of life. Abstinence for young people is the only certain way to avoid sexually transmitted diseases.
Abstinence-only sex ed is pretty much exactly what it sounds like, which is a class where abstinence is presented as the only way to prevent pregnancy and STIs. All birth control is going to fail, STIs are inevitable, and the only way to protect yourself is to just not have sex until you're married.
What if I want to have sex before I get married?
Well, I guess you just have to be prepared to die.
Abstinence-only sex ed got its start under Reagan with the passage of the Adolescent Family Life Act of 1981. It was one of the policies that emerged as the religious right grew their political influence, and a lot of those early abstinence programs also included a lot of religious education. Getting this government funding also came with some pretty terrible stipulations, namely that abortion and contraceptives could never be presented in a positive light, and that sex outside of marriage needed to be presented as inherently harmful.
In my sex education class, they handed out workbooks and they taught us a lot about different sexually transmitted diseases and the dangers of contracting them, and I guess they talked about the importance of abstinence, and there was a lot of things about AIDS, there's a big focus on that.
There was no discussion of condom usage at all. No.
They showed us no visuals. They weren't allowed to even bring them into the classroom and say, this is a condom, this is how you use it. They weren't allowed to do anything like that.
We're still spending money on these programs today, with the total cost exceeding $2 billion at this point. Studies done in the years since have shown pretty clearly that abstinence-only sex ed is a failure, its most notable effect being not that kids are less likely to have sex, only that they're less likely to have sex safely. That pregnancy and STI rates were higher for kids that had abstinence-only sex ed than it was for kids that had comprehensive sex ed.
We're spending money on abstinence education. We're the third highest teen pregnancy rate in the country. Is there a problem, disconnect between one and the other?
I don't know. Look, it gets in line with other programs that we have that we spend money on, and do they work 100% or do they work 5%? And that's a bigger and a better issue than, well, we have the third highest teenage pregnancy rate.
Not that the facts ever mattered, because abstinence-only sex ed was never really about protecting young people. In her really excellent, if unsettling book, The Purity Myth, Jessica Valenti argues that this focus on abstinence is part of a larger virginity movement, which has as its end goal the control of women and girls.
The virginity movement is much more than just the same old sexism. It's a targeted and well-funded backlash that is rolling back women's rights, using revamped and modernized definitions of purity, morality, and sexuality. Its goals are mired in old-school gender roles, and the tool it's using is young women's sexuality. Now, instead of women's virginity being explicitly bought and sold with dowries and business deals, it's being defined as little more than a stand-in for actual morality.
And it was the violation of this virginity-based structuring of morality that prompted the backlash against 90210. Earlier, I called Brandon the moral center of the show, and that's true, but only in later seasons. In season 1, the moral center is the Walsh household, Brenda included. Their traditional Midwestern values serve as a counterpoint to the debauched values of Beverly Hills. So, for example, Steve's racism doesn't undermine the moral order of the show. Rather, the contrast between Steve's racism and Brandon's open-mindedness serves to affirm Brandon's morality, even though he keeps hanging out with a racist.
Don't let those suckers intimidate you, Brandon. This is our school, not theirs.
Only in your mind, Steve.
People invested in a virginity-based morality could draw a similar contrast between Kelly and Brenda, as Kelly is sexually active and uninterested in monogamy, while Brenda is a virgin in a relationship with Dylan. But when Brenda has sex, that contrast breaks down. Since the moral organization of the show hasn't changed, and Brenda's still part of the moral center, it suggests that having sex isn't inherently immoral for women, hence the backlash. I think this is why Darren Star talks about the need for Brenda to be punished, the need for her to suffer consequences. Punishment reintroduces virginity into the moral logic of the show, albeit somewhat imperfectly. Punishing Brenda may demonstrate that sex is wrong, but Brenda can never go back to being a virgin, which, if you're trying to appease an angry right wing, is a real problem. It means you need a new moral organization for your show.
4, 3, 2, 1, Earth.
Without a virginal Brenda to serve as a contrast, the show no longer had a safe way to introduce sex into its plots, at least as it related to teenagers. So it had to go. For the next couple seasons, the sex lives of the kids of 90210 becomes very unclear. It's not that they stop having sex exactly. The show just gets a bit vague about it. Does Brandon have sex with Emily Valentine, who he dates for several episodes? Well, he does this when he's high on drugs.
Brandon, what are you doing? It's almost 1 in the morning. Actually, it's past 1 in the morning.
I don't know. What are we doing?
I don't know, but I don't think we're done yet.
But it's honestly never clear. Does Brandon have sex with Nikki, his girlfriend in season 3? Well, when Rosie O'Donnell asks them about it on national television, they say not yet.
So, are you doing it? So have you?
Yeah, I have.
And you?
Yeah, I have.
You have. Just not with each other. Yet. Right?
But do they have sex after that? Who's to say? Stop asking so many questions. What about Dylan? Does Dylan have sex with that rich older lady who raises horses or something that he inexplicably spends an episode with? It certainly feels like they do. That episode is incredibly horny.
Horses get bored if they're always ridden by the same person.
But when you watch it back, you realize it's never confirmed. Sex just keeps existing in this ambivalent space, where the writers leave just enough room that you can suspect the characters are having sex, even though it's never discussed. It's like we're watching a movie from the 40s all of a sudden. Two people start making out, then the camera pans to the right, maybe the wind blows the curtains around, and you're left to draw your own conclusions. In season 1, it's always pretty clear who's having sex. In season 2, it's anyone's guess. Sex does still exist, but it exists exclusively as an adult concern, and the ethics are pretty straightforward. Brandon works for a rich man cheating on his alcoholic wife, so Brandon quits his job and shames the mistress until she leaves California. The kids meet a couple on their honeymoon whose marriage nearly falls apart because the husband says he doesn't want kids, but his wife is secretly pregnant. But then he finds out and changes his mind. Kelly's mom and David's dad are dating, but when Kelly's mom gets pregnant unexpectedly, it nearly destroys the relationship before the two decide to get married. These aren't adults with messy sex lives, these are parables for the kids. Don't cheat. Sex outside of marriage can ruin a marriage. Having sex outside of marriage leads to kids. It's all very cut and dry. Compare this with season 1, which has an episode where Jim and Cindy are pursued by this wacky polyamorous couple from Texas. I really love this subplot. The setup is that Jim and Cindy really want to turn one of Jim's business trips into a sex vacation, but every time they touch each other, this couple pops up trying to coax Jim and Cindy into an orgy. Or a swap maybe, it's never really clear, but it's definitely one of those two things.
Oh, now don't you be no party pooper on me, Jim Walsh. The fun is just starting.
How are you tonight, Cindy?
I'm fine, Bob. How are you?
I'm game.
But the show never presents them as monsters. If anything, it shows them as having a pretty good relationship. They're certainly on the same page about Jim and Cindy. But there is no room for this couple in season 2. Season 2 is like sex is for marriage, marital sex is for kids, anything other than monogamy makes you a monster. Interestingly, the show rather openly addresses the change in the way it's talking about sex. This happens in season 2, episode 21, in an episode titled Everybody's Talkin' About It. Not Everybody's Talking About It, Everybody's Talkin' About It, like the kids say. It starts with West Beverly High preparing to give a survey about sexual attitudes, which ultimately gets canceled due to protests from parents who don't want the school to be talking about sex at all. Andrea is upset, so she starts pushing for a variety of measures to raise awareness about sexual health. This includes a proposal to distribute condoms in the school, as well as a special edition of the school newspaper featuring personal stories from students about sex. This is one of 90210's issue episodes. But the issue isn't condoms in school or sexual health. The issue is, should people be talking about sex at all? Hence the name, Everybody's Talking About It. But should they? All episode long, people just keep getting upset with Andrea for trying to drive this conversation about sex. They're mad at her for giving interviews, they're mad at her for being so forceful, and they are particularly mad at her for trying to get them to write articles for the school paper. Andrea only ever gets one submission for these stories, and everyone else is furious. Kelly's mad at being asked at all.
I don't know what you people from the Blaze are trying to accomplish, but I would appreciate it if you'd leave me out of it.
Dylan and Brenda get in this really strange fight because Brenda considers writing a story about her pregnancy scare.
As often as you read about girls who become pregnant unintentionally, you cannot imagine the feelings until you believe you are in the situation yourself. You were going to print that? It's very personal to me, and you are not going to print it.
Yeah, Brenda, sex is private. Why weren't you thinking about how this could affect Dylan?
Dylan, I was only writing that piece because I think there's a need for it.
You have good intentions, Bren. But right now, I need to keep my private life very, very private. I thought you knew that.
Yeah, he's got a lot of stuff going on right now. Come on, Brenda. And this is a critique of how the show presented sex in that first season, and how it sought to show the sex lives of these teenagers in a way that was realistic and helpful to its young audience. The admonitions the teens level at Andrea are the same ones that were leveled at Fox. Tone it down. This stuff doesn't belong on television.
Network television was still stuck in this kind of like 50s mentality about teens and sex. And the mentality was, you don't talk about teenagers having sex, you don't think about teenagers having sex.
And it should come as no surprise that this is also the episode where the show reintroduces virginity. An ongoing subplot in this episode is that Andrea is a virgin, a fact she feels ashamed about, even as she advocates for additional sexual awareness. Well, it's more that she's made to feel ashamed about it.
What you don't want to admit is that you don't know that much about the other part of it. The part that doesn't show up in statistics or surveys. Andre, if you had a little more experience, you'd know that love is not a public health issue.
The episode really wants to have it both ways, where Brandon apologizes for what he said, but it's never rejected as being untrue. The episode very much clings to the idea that Andrea doesn't understand sex, but, at least according to Kelly, she shouldn't want to.
You're not missing out on anything you can't do later on. Me? I can never go back.
You're sure talking a lot about sex, Andrea, but have you thought about virginity? And hey, you remember that one article Andrea got for her special sex edition of the school paper? Turns out that article was about being a virgin.
It's called, Okay, So I'm a Virgin.
Andrea actually has a boy confess to her that he was the virgin who wrote the article, and then she asks him out. This poor guy has spent the entire episode trying to get her to pay attention to him.
You know what I was thinking? After school today, maybe you and I could go over to the college library.
Yes!
Really?
I mean, no.
And it is his confession of virginity that seals the deal. This episode is so weird.
Just because you have 4 hooves doesn't mean you have to follow the herd.
And this is what the writers really want to say. The lesson they really want Andrea to learn. That people need to stop talking about how great sex is and start talking about how great virginity is. That's where the episode lands. That's why Andrea only gets one story, a story about virginity for her school paper. That's why Andrea is presented as shrill, vain, and out of touch for her attempts to raise awareness about sexual health. Because the show wants you to understand that her desire to talk about sex springs from her mistakenly idealizing sex, when it's actually virginity that's great.
Who am I to try to educate people about safer sex when I've never... You're probably much better off.
It is the reestablishment of virginity as an organizing moral principle in the show. But at the end of the day, 90210 needs a virgin to make this project happen, and Andrea can't be it. She can be a person who hasn't had sex, but she's too modern, too liberal, and too Jewish to be the linchpin in what is fundamentally a conservative Christian moral order. Which brings us all the way back around to Donna. In addition to teaching us why it's wrong to be too open about sex, this same episode is the episode that introduces Donna's commitment to remaining a virgin. It also introduces David's commitment to being a sex pest, which is appropriate, but let's put a pin in that for now. Early on in this episode, Donna comes out in favor of having condoms available in school.
It's like if you have a swimming pool in your backyard.
Which David interprets as Donna being potentially open to having sex.
You know what I'm saying?
Absolutely.
It's a not unreasonable assumption, but maybe have a conversation with Donna about it. But this is a soap, which is a format that generates 80% of its conflict by having its characters avoid precisely those kinds of conversations. So of course David doesn't do that. Instead, David spends the rest of the episode running around, trying to get practical advice from his friends, and being shamed for his attempts.
Do you ever know there were so many varieties?
What'd you get, one of each?
So what kind of ID do you need to rent a hotel room?
David, do I look like Ann Landers?
I will never understand why David is so desperate to be friends with these people. This all culminates in a scene where David tries to awkwardly put the moves on Donna, who reveals that she intends to stay a virgin until marriage. A revelation she handles in the most confusing, stilted way possible.
I don't intend to sleep with you.
It's too soon.
No, I'm not gonna do that. With anybody.
You mean ever?
Well, with my husband, of course. I mean, I'm not entering a convent or anything, for God's sake.
And why does she want to stay a virgin?
Life is complicated enough without getting involved in a sexual relationship.
Oh, cool. So it's not religious or anything. Yeah, no, totally. I get it. That makes sense. I'm sure this won't change in season 3.
God will always love you.
Even me, Father Chris?
Yes, Donna, even you.
Even if I sleep with my boyfriend before I get married?
Huh. Okay. As I've said, I think 90210 needed a virgin. The controversy around Brenda having sex with Dylan forced the show to demonstrate a commitment to virginity-based morality, and there isn't a convenient way to do that unless you have a virgin. If the show doesn't have a virgin, the only way to affirm a virginity-based morality would be to punish people for violations. It's far more efficient and a lot easier to watch if they just introduce a virgin for the show to champion. So the show settled on Donna. She had barely been a character up to this point, which made her the perfect choice. She was a blank slate onto which they could inscribe this set of values. Unlike Andrea, who was a virgin because she hadn't had the opportunity to have sex yet, Donna could be written as someone with the opportunity to have sex, but who chose not to. Her virginity could be actively maintained rather than passively accepted. And, as I laid out earlier, this is the beginning of Donna living inside this repeating virginity plot with a very basic format. Boyfriend pesters Donna for sex.
Come on, Donna, it's a special day, don't you feel it?
Donna is conflicted.
He was interviewing me like I was the last American virgin, and he was laughing at me.
Donna decides to remain true to her religious principles.
They were waiting in the living room to take me to church. I can't really talk.
And as this plot plays out over and over again, it's inevitably boring, because while her commitment to virginity can be tested, her commitment can never be interrogated. Even though Donna doesn't mention religion in that initial conversation with David, that can't last. Without religion, her choice would lack a moral component. She'd just be a person who didn't want to have sex, rather than a good person. So it was inevitable that her virginity would be tied back to religion. But the second the show does this, that's the end of any examination. We can talk about her feelings about being a virgin.
I mean, in a way, it's sort of like a roller coaster.
Or about her struggle to remain a virgin.
My biggest fear is that being a virgin will cost me every relationship that I have.
But we can't talk about her decision to remain a virgin, because that would mean interrogating a religious dogma, which 90210 is not about to do.
Your virginity is a gift, Donna.
So Donna is always faced with the same straightforward choice: have sex or be good. And I want to be clear that there's nothing wrong with choosing to not have sex. There's no reason to interrogate somebody's decision to not have sex at any given time, but the same can't be said about virginity as an abstract moral principle. From a very young age, I was being taught at home, at church, and through the popular culture I was allowed to consume that sex before marriage was wrong. This was well before I started going through puberty, which is to say, well before I had any real understanding of what sex actually is. But all the same, my church was encouraging me to make commitments to virginity, and at home it was made clear that I was expected to remain a virgin until I was married. By the time I started going through puberty a few years later, I was primed to feel shame and anxiety at my own development, to treat it as something that might imperil my morality or endanger the promises I made to my church or my parents or God. And that is messed up. There's a reason that contracts signed by minors are unenforceable, and that's because minors aren't considered emotionally or mentally capable of comprehending those kinds of agreements. Yet purity culture asks this of children all the time, sometimes even with fake contracts to sign. And sure, these aren't binding agreements, but the whole idea here is to give it a sense of authority, to give extra weight to the decisions being made by people who can't comprehend what it is they're agreeing to. This simulation of authority is very clear when you look at purity balls, which are structured to resemble a wedding, only it's a mass wedding and one between fathers and daughters. In these ceremonies, daughters will pledge to remain a virgin until marriage, and fathers will pledge to protect their daughter's virginity. The fathers will then give their daughters a purity ring, with the expectation that they'll wear it in place of a wedding ring until they get married. It's a strange pantomime of a relationship, but with the father standing in for the actual romantic partner.
You talk about yourself as your daughter's boyfriend. That's going to have make an awful lot of people uncomfortable.
See, this is what I find absolutely humorous in our culture today, where something as pure as a daddy going out with his daughter on a date is twisted to make it seem like, as you mentioned, Freudian. I wasn't thinking about Freud at all. I was thinking about having a great time with my daughter.
And yeah, this practice seems extreme, but the second you have parents asking children to make sex promises, you're already most of the way there. It's not like if you got rid of all the ceremony, it would be okay. The main problem isn't the ring, it's the promise. And of course, people should wait to have sex until they're emotionally prepared for it. And many teenagers aren't. Because they're children. And children that aren't emotionally ready for sex aren't emotionally ready to sign sex contracts with their parents. There is a power dynamic at play here that is weird and unacceptable.
As a young person, I was confused and wanted so badly to be good and wanted so badly to please God and to be acceptable in my community, with my leaders looking over my shoulder and moreover my peers sitting right next to me signing their contracts. I signed the pledge.
And these kinds of power dynamics are all over the Donna plots, most notably in how involved her parents are in her sex life.
It's just that I gave them my word that I wouldn't.
My favorite comes late in season 3, as for the second time that season, Donna is considering having sex with David, as David continues to pester Donna for sex.
David, I'm really nervous.
Oh, but don't be. You said prom night was our night. It's a night to remember.
This time, she agrees to have sex with him after prom, but feels conflicted about it, as happens in most of these plots. This conflict is set up early on with an incredible reveal that really highlights the subtle symbolism that 90210 is known for.
Here. When you were little, you always wanted to wear this. I think now's the time.
I don't think so. I don't really think it goes.
Oh, that is perfect.
Perfect. Apart from being hilariously on the nose, this scene also gets to the ambivalent way that purity culture handles the bodies of women and girls, displaying them while simultaneously marking them as prohibited. This is how purity rings work. They don't simply communicate purity, they mark a body as both sexed and prohibited. This is why purity balls take place around the age of puberty. The purity being expressed isn't the absence of sexuality, it's sexuality suppressed, a mark of control. And as the show goes on, Donna's body is constantly a site for this kind of articulation of power. She'll end up in plots where she's demonstrating the bizarre routines she had to learn for debutante balls.
They've turned her into a trained seal.
Or she'll join a beauty pageant with all kinds of arcane rules she has to follow.
All of them are uniformly impressive.
Or she'll have plots where her boyfriends get upset about the way that she dresses.
If you want me to dress differently, just tell me and I will.
The show displays her as attractive in order to have characters continually negotiate for access to or control of her body. Because it's only in this negotiation, in this repeated denial of access, that her morality can be affirmed.
Staying pure and innocent is touted as the greatest thing we can do. However, equating this inaction with morality not only is problematic because it continues to tie women's ethics to our bodies, but also is downright insulting because it suggests that women can't be moral actors. Instead, we're defined by what we don't do. Our ethics are the ethics of passivity.
As terrible as 90210 can be to its other female characters, they make choices in a way that Donna never can. Kelly joins a cult, Andrea cheats on her husband, Valerie kills her father, but it feels like Donna's plots always require the passive voice. Donna is abused by Ray. Donna is randomly attacked by a stranger. Donna is propositioned by a modeling agent. Donna is always acted upon, is always the wronged party, bearing up under the pressure of people who have lost their way. Once it was decided that Donna would be the show's virgin, the die was cast. Donna can't be a complex character. She can't face challenging decisions because her morality can't be examined. There's no causal link between virginity and morality. Nothing about staying a virgin makes the world a better place. So instead, her status as moral needs to be assumed, needs to exist outside of causal logic. We know Donna is good, not because she's actually doing anything good, but because people keep saying she's good.
Donna Martin is the kind of girl that goes out of her way for people.
Andrea's always told me how you're everyone's guardian angel.
Donna's making us all look bad.
And there are characters on the show that do good. Kelly cares about helping people and spends a season or two working in a free clinic. Andrea advocates for political causes and spends her free time doing volunteer work.
We average about 5 calls a night from guys your age whose mother or sisters catch them masturbating.
And yet both Andrea and Kelly hold up Donna as the moral standard, even though she spends most of her free time dating and designing clothes.
Andrea, do you think I'm selfish? Please, you're one of the most unselfish people I've ever met.
Characters like Andrea and Kelly do good things, which helps define them as good people. But with Donna, that logic is reversed. Donna is a good person, which helps define her actions as being good. And this is what makes Donna so boring. She is, before anything else, a strategy. She's not there because the writers wanted to explore what it meant to be a virgin in the 90s, or because someone had some really good ideas for some plot lines. She's a response to a backlash, a way to keep the Christian Coalition happy and keep affiliates off the backs of Fox executives. Her character always comes second to the ethics she needs to enforce, and those ethics are a narrative dead end. They can't be questioned without upsetting the very people Donna is meant to appease. So Donna is stuck acting out a narrow version of goodness again and again, season after season. And goodness is always kind of boring, even if we weren't talking about a version of goodness that severely limits her agency. I feel I do need to mention that Donna does eventually lose her virginity in the season 7 finale. It's a pretty ridiculous scene, taking place in one of those alternate dimensions where the world is made up of candles and soft lighting. In universe, there isn't a great explanation for why Donna decides to have sex now.
Why now?
Well, one part of my life ended today when we graduated. And now I want to spend the next part with you.
She's just like, college is over, time to be a different person, which is fine, I guess, but it doesn't really address any of the questions about religion or morality that have historically been pretty important to Donna. The show also treats it as some kind of romantic culmination for David and Donna.
How'd I get so lucky?
You waited.
And this is just a flat misrepresentation. David pestered her for sex for years, then cheated on her when she wouldn't give it up. But there's a narrative that needs to be served here, and David needs to be presented as somebody who earned Donna's virginity in order to validate the idea that virginity has intrinsic value. It's a bad look if Donna's just like, you'll do. That's the narrative justification for Donna losing her virginity, which doesn't make a ton of sense. But there's also the managerial justification. Tori Spelling had, at least in her own telling, been pushing for Donna to lose her virginity for years, but the idea had always been shot down by her father, producer Aaron Spelling. When her father finally did agree, he asked Jason Priestley, the actor that played Brandon, to direct the scene. So it's hard for me to watch this scene and not think of it as Tori Spelling being given permission by her father to have one male co-star stage and direct her having implied sex with a different male co-star. Which, yikes. It's almost too on the nose that Donna's first sexual experience is mediated through all these different layers of control. I bring this up to say that it's easy to look at the character of Donna and think that having her be this annoying virgin isn't that big a deal. That it's just an innocuous choice in a silly show for kids. But Donna's character wasn't an artistic choice, it was a political one. A reflection of the kinds of changes that were sweeping over the show, changes for which Donna was only one part. Just a quick content warning. The remainder of the video is going to be very heavily focused on sexual violence and its representation within 90210. Of all the characters in season 1, I think Kelly is the most interesting. Jenny Garth, the actress who played her, has actually talked about how she didn't like the initial representation of Kelly, calling it one-dimensional, but I really don't agree with this characterization. Kelly has a pretty interesting backstory. Her parents are divorced, and her father appears to be almost wholly absent from her life. Her mom has been her primary caregiver, but struggles with addiction to drugs and alcohol, which has forced Kelly to confront adult issues far younger than many of her peers. All this meaning that Kelly has, for many years, largely had to raise herself while also being a caretaker for her mom. When we meet Kelly in the show, she seems pretty well adjusted. She's popular, self-possessed, and a bit of a gossip. She's also sexually active, likes to date around, and doesn't feel ashamed of either of these things.
I don't get it. Dating's your life, isn't it?
I know it is.
She's kind of a prototype version of Samantha from Sex and the City.
What's next? Do I get pinned or something?
Yeah, preferably to the mattress.
I don't know. Everyone says he's trouble.
Well, he can trouble me all he wants.
Sweetheart, he's a man, not a brownstone.
Honey, when I'm through with him, he'll be Gracie Mansion.
Sex doesn't define Kelly, but she does have a complicated relationship to it. She likes it, but she's also a kid, and this can lead to her making mistakes, as when she has drunken sex with Steve and comes to regret it the next day.
15 minutes of fun. Lifetime of regret.
She's also a victim of sexual violence, a fact that she reveals to her friends at one point. It plays out at a slumber party featuring Brenda, Donna, Andrea, Kelly, and Kelly's terrible friend Amanda, who only exists in this one episode. They're playing a game that's sort of like Truth or Dare, and Kelly is asked about her first time.
What was your first sexual experience?
So Kelly talks about her first time with Steve, and it's a sweet, if fairly unremarkable story. Then her terrible friend Amanda is all like,
No.
Why don't you tell them about the real first time you had sex?
she is the worst. It turns out she's referring to the time Kelly was assaulted by an upperclassman, and it is crazy that she would try and force Kelly to recount this story, but Kelly does anyway. It's a tough scene, but Garth does a really good job. I like that Kelly is given the opportunity to tell her story while surrounded by her friends. I like that Kelly's words are considered enough, that we don't need to get her attacker's point of view or see some terrible reenactment. And I like that she doesn't consider her assault her first time. I get that the show is suggesting that she's hiding her actual first time, but I prefer to think that she's taking control of her own narrative. Valenti at one point points out that there is no medical definition of virginity, that it's a socially constructed concept with boundaries that are negotiated as parts of different ideological projects. Systems construct a version of virginity that suits their specific organization of power.
Here's what I teach them. What you're doing with your boyfriend or girlfriend, would you be doing it in front of your father if he was watching? That's the line.
It's not an accident that, under patriarchal systems, virginity is both a heteronormative construct in its frequent reliance on heterosexual penetrative sex, as well as a construct that does not take consent into account. But there's no need to define virginity that way. When Kelly is asked about her first time, she responds with the first time she gave consent, a time she remembers fondly, rather than a time when she was attacked. Her trauma doesn't cease to exist, but it also doesn't dictate her identity, and she isn't obligated to consider it some sort of sexual origin story. And this is what I really like about the way that Kelly is presented in the first season. The show lets her write her story her way, and it doesn't look down on her choices.
Never rely on the guy. Memorize that.
You sound so clinical.
Dear, clinical is what time shall we schedule the procedure?
Then, in season 2, Kelly reveals that actually, sex has ruined her life and she regrets all of it.
When I was a freshman, I threw myself at a senior who pushed me into a bush and never talked to me again. For the next year and a half, I spent all my time trying to live up to that reputation. And now, even though I've changed, I never know whether a guy asks me out because he likes me or because he thinks I'm easy.
Kelly is no longer the author of her own story. Instead, she's trying to live up to the stories men told about her after she was assaulted. Season 2 robs Kelly of her choices, of her ability to author her own life, and I hate it. In her original design, Kelly had desire of her own, enjoyed dating, and was uninterested in commitment. To the extent that morality enters into her dating life, it centers on her consent rather than her sexuality. And for the time period, this made the character too transgressive.
Kelly over here gets noticed. I mean, How are you
going to say this nicely?
If I'm not mistaken on the show, you're like a slut.
For a show trying to pivot to a more conservative morality, Kelly was way too far out of bounds. If Brenda needed to be punished for having sex, then Kelly needed to be punished for being sexual. The most obvious example of this punishment is meted out in season 2's Halloween episode, helpfully titled Halloween. Kelly is coming off a breakup and attends a Halloween party looking to meet someone. She flirts with some guys, meets one she likes, and while talking to him later in the night, he attempts to assault her. She holds him off until her friends show up and they throw him out of the party. But what 90210 wants you to understand about this whole plot is that it's kinda Kelly's fault. When Kelly first enters the party, the camera gawks at her like some horny teenage boy, and for the rest of the night, her friends are getting on her case.
Did your mom see you like this?
What is supposed to be some kind of gownless evening strap?
I'm looking at what you're wearing, and I'm thinking this is exactly the kind of make-believe you have in mind.
And just in case you missed what the show is trying to say, after she fights off her attacker, she has this exchange.
I thought I was being all sexy dressing like this, you know. Look where it got me.
Kelly, I tried to tell you that the dress was a little too much.
Jesus Christ, Brenda! That comment wouldn't have been acceptable at any time, but it has been less than 5 minutes since your friend was attacked. You're still in the room where it happened. This fits into the broader narrative of purity culture, which works to put all moral responsibility for sex onto women. It works like this. Sex is wrong for everyone.
Sex outside marriage is like fire in the middle of the floor. It's going to burn your house down and destroy your life.
But men have higher sex drives than women, which prevents them from controlling themselves. Since men can't control themselves, they can't be held responsible for their actions.
Guys were given 2 heads and only enough blood in their body to control one at a time.
Women who can control themselves therefore bear responsibility for stopping sex. To prevent sex, women now bear the responsibility to prevent men from becoming aroused and losing control.
Well, ladies, I believe you also have a unique opportunity to protect the purity of your brothers in the Lord. What I think you probably are not aware of is how difficult it is for a guy to look at a girl with purity in his heart when she is dressed immodestly.
Thus, if women dress provocatively, or flirt, or do anything that might arouse any man in any way, they're causing men to lose control and neglecting their moral duty to preserve their own purity as well as the purity of men. Kate Harding refers to this as the girls as gatekeepers construct.
The girls as gatekeepers construct suggests that adolescence is like a zombie invasion. As soon as the pituitary gland virus starts making its way around our children's classrooms, half of them will lose all rational thought, compassion, and assorted other markers of humanity, while the other half must learn to live in a state of fear and battle readiness. Boys, and later men, are not only relieved of any responsibility for sexual aggression, but robbed of the ability to define their own sexuality, which may or may not naturally involve pushiness, selfishness, or female partners. Girls and women, meanwhile, learn to frame being violated as a personal failure, a battle they inadequately prepared for.
And this is probably the most insidious part of these narratives, which is that when women are made to bear moral responsibility for male violence, the existence of male violence becomes evidence of the moral failing of women. In a system like this, Kelly was attacked because Kelly is a bad person. If Kelly hadn't dressed the way she did, if she hadn't been flirting, then none of this would have happened.
What's the message that ends up coming out of this episode, Jenny?
Well, like Kelly said, she wants to make an impression, and a lot of young girls want to make an impression, and they just don't know what that impression is, and sometimes guys take it the wrong way, and things happen that they don't have any control over, and the message is just be aware that you're always a potential victim, and just be smart about it.
And this whole episode shows why the character of Donna is so harmful. Not because she's a virgin, but because her virginity is being used to underwrite a system of logic where male violence is the punishment for women failing to conform. The vision of morality offered by purity culture is just putting a coat of paint on a threat. Follow these rules or else.
You're not a Christian.
Yes, I am.
If you were a Christian, your heart would not be this hard towards people that love you and towards counsel like this. Your heart is so hard. I say it's a church game and you don't know Jesus, and that's a far more serious problem than just what she's talking about. Although you are going to lose your virginity and you are probably going to get date raped and you probably are going to get trashed.
For Andrea Dworkin, there's a terrible but understandable logic to the women who adhere to systems like this. to the real Donnas. These women recognize the threat of male violence and choose to cling to the hollow promises of protection offered by systems like purity culture. Kelly is an object lesson in navigating male violence under purity culture. Her crime is immodesty, inflaming male desire, and her punishment is violence. If Donna represents the privileges of conformity, Kelly represents the consequences of rebellion. If Donna is the carrot, Kelly is the stick. When the show associates Donna's virginity with her virtue, it is making a virtue out of her effective resistance to normalized male aggression. Good women resist, bad women fail to resist. All this is in service of casting male coercion and sexual violence as being inevitable and morally neutral. Which leads us to the final thing I want to talk about. I mentioned it at the beginning, but when I watched 90210, Donna was the only character that provoked strong feelings in me, and the main feeling she provoked was anger. If I'm honest, all the research, all the writing, all the time I've put into this came from me trying to understand that anger. As much as I'd love to say that what I felt was righteous indignation for the way that women are treated under purity culture, and while I do feel anger about that, I think my anger was related to something a bit closer to home. I think it was about the way that boys are treated. This isn't to say that purity culture is harder on men than it is on women. That's very obviously not the case. But it still does harm men, and particularly boys, in its own way. Because the structure that is built up around virginity with Donna at its center doesn't only create structures for women, it creates structures for men too. This is why, when we get Donna the Virgin, we also get David the Sex Pest. See, after Donna tells David that she intends to stay a virgin until marriage, it kicks off a multi-season arc for David, running from about season 2 through the end of season 4, which is David trying to get Donna to sleep with him anyway. He whines, he begs, he looks for loopholes.
Look, if you're ready, I am.
Well, I don't know if I am yet.
But you might be soon. Oh, come on, Donna. You said we'd do it on prom night, and you've been putting me off all summer. Maybe I wouldn't be in such a bad mood all the time if I had a girlfriend who was capable of a mature relationship. You know, Donna, now would be as good a time as any for me and you to get married. Tomorrow we can have it annulled, but tonight...
And when all this fails and he still doesn't break up with Donna, it's treated as a sign of his devotion.
You must love me.
Believe me, after what happened last night and the fact that I'm still here today, proves it.
If you're wondering what happened last night, she took an antihistamine and it made her sleepy. Even though David was trying to have sex with her. And what's weird is that no one in the cast ever treats David's behavior as anything other than normal. People will support Donna's resistance to David, but never condemn David for constantly putting Donna in a position to resist him. People only start calling David a bad person when he finally breaks up with Donna because he wants a sexual relationship and she doesn't.
How could he break up with me on Christmas? And all because I wouldn't sleep with him.
Actually, that's a great reason to break up. There's nothing wrong with breaking up with someone because one of you wants a sexual relationship and the other doesn't. You should break up. That's not a solvable problem. But under purity culture, men are taught that it's wrong to break up with women over sex. Men are fed an ambivalent ethic about sex. On the one hand, they're taught that their inability to control their sexual urges is a defining aspect of their masculinity, and on the other, they're taught that sex is wrong. It's okay for David to pressure Donna for sex even though she's made her position clear. That's just him being a man. But it's not okay for David to break up with Donna over her refusal to have sex, because that would be punishing her for being a woman, for acting out her part in purity culture.
It's not only, for ourselves to be pure, but it's protecting our brothers in Christ, and it's more of a way of helping them stay pure too.
Ultimately, Donna's virtue is given shape only through David's pressure campaign. In a virginity-based morality, it's not actually the virginity that makes one moral, it's the resistance. There is no virtue in maintaining virginity absent male attention. Spinster characters aren't held up as paragons of virtue, ideals to be replicated. They're objects of pity, failed women. Their virginity is a mark of shame because it's not enough on its own. Virginity only becomes moral when it's maintained despite male attention. This is why spinsters will have plots where they marry ministers, because the spinster's virginity is being redeemed as moral through a man's attention. The good woman doesn't not have sex, the good woman resists. So where is the morality for men in this terrible system? Well, this takes us back to the ambivalent messages that purity culture feeds men. Under this system, morality for men lies in respecting female resistance in some abstract, poorly defined way. It's not, don't pressure women for sex. Under purity culture, male pressure is assumed. It's uncontrollable.
For the guy, in all honesty, for the guy, just the kissing part is not enough most of the time.
Instead, morality for men is, don't take that pressure too far.
A guy always has a choice of not making her do something she doesn't want to do.
And this is a terrible message. Pressure implies resistance, so to be pressuring at all is to already not be respecting somebody's boundaries. Go down this road far enough, and you're inevitably trying to delineate a line where acceptable pressure becomes coercion or violence. But there is no line. Pressure is already a problem. Which leads me to what is probably the nadir of 90210, the Season 4 episode, Take Back the Night. I alluded to this earlier, but in Season 4, Steve rapes a woman named Laura. This isn't how the show views it. The show treats Laura terribly and consistently undermines her position, but even so, it's hard not to come down on her side. Steve's like, she wanted it.
Believe me, she was into it.
And Laura's like, I absolutely did not.
I begged him to stop.
And the show's like, what a pickle. How are we supposed to figure this one out? As if it's only rape if both of them can agree that it was. When Laura comes to terms with what Steve did, she decides to name him at a Take Back the Night rally in order to let other women know that he's a danger. But unfortunately, this is not the story of a woman gaining the strength to confront her accuser. No, this is the story of a woman learning to take personal responsibility for her assault. Kelly, assault victim Kelly, who starts out extremely supportive of Laura, turns on her when she finds out that it's Steve she's accusing.
I believe you, and I will stand by you. Steve? No, but I know him, and he's not like that.
This Steve.
Look, Steve, I'm just not in the mood, okay? I don't want to drink, and I don't want to follow you to the bedroom.
Steve.
Today we do everything like we planned. I'm with Rory, you're with Claire, but tomorrow we pull the old switcheroo.
Ultimately, Kelly convinces Laura not to come forward with her story. She does this by getting up on stage at the Take Back the Night rally before Laura can and talking about what a great guy Steve is.
Maybe if there were more people out there like Steve, we wouldn't have to hold a rally to be able to go outside at night.
Steve is a good guy. Steve protected me. We need more guys like Steve. Her speech convinces Laura to back off and leads to one of the most horrific moments in all of 90210 when Laura finally confronts Steve.
Laura, you could have buried me tonight.
Yeah, well, I didn't have a choice. I didn't say yes, but I never said no.
The show is just like, case closed. Don't worry, everybody. We figured it out. It was her fault all along. For the show, the issue isn't the lack of a yes, it's an inadequate no. This sentiment shows up in the Halloween episode as well, where the show uses Kelly's explicit non-consent as the point where her attacker's aggression and coercion becomes unacceptable.
You said no.
And after that, what happened isn't your fault.
Steve didn't fail to get consent. Laura failed to adequately let Steve know that his pressure had shifted into violence. That's the thing. The show doesn't end with Laura deciding that she wasn't actually harmed or that she did want to have sex. The harm is still there. She just decides that even though she was harmed, it was somehow her own fault. Steve is just erased from the equation. And this leaves us in a strange world where male sexuality is abstracted from the choices men are making. Male sexuality is just this harmful force that exists out in the world, constantly causing harm, always potentially a risk, but fundamentally amoral, like an earthquake or a tornado. Birds gonna fly, fish gonna swim, men gonna pursue sex with a sociopathic single-mindedness. Harm to women lies at the core of how purity culture views male sexuality.
When you have sex outside of marriage, it's like they take something from you.
I'm worried that I'm gonna do something wrong, and I don't want to hurt Michelle in any way.
It's not just in the way that ordinary male sexuality is conceived of as a state of constant pressure, of automatically seeking to violate boundaries, but also in the way that female virginity is associated with morality. If maintaining virginity is good, then losing it is bad. Male sexuality is thus a moral hazard for women. If Kelly experiences male sexuality as a physical threat, Donna experiences it as a moral threat.
A boy.
Yep, it's a reoccurring theme.
And this is what purity culture teaches men about their sexuality, that it is uncontrollable and that it causes harm.
Then why do you act the way you do? Sometimes I follow my heart and everything's okay. And then Mr. Green Jeans has his own ideas.
And this is what I think made me so angry at Donna, that I was engaging with a way of thinking that I've spent the better part of my adult life trying to leave behind. But these lessons are so deeply ingrained, were such a major part of the way I was raised that they're hard to get rid of. I was taught to believe in the same model that Donna is there to represent, that virtue and virginity are inseparable for women and girls. And what I took away from all this was, when I have sex with a woman, I am doing harm. And while intellectually I know this isn't true, even now, decades removed from when I became sexually active, it's a struggle for me to consider my own sexuality as not being inherently destructive. And when I went to watch 90210, I wasn't expecting to be reminded of all of this. I was suddenly caught up in a web of associations, hearing dog whistles to the regressive sexual politics of the time, to the language and iconography that surrounded my own coming of age. Maybe I should have expected it, but I didn't. When I spent 90 minutes mapping it out, it all makes sense, but I just didn't see it coming. I was never allowed to watch 90210 growing up, and it was presented to me as one of the most immoral shows on television. In my imagination, it had always been some sort of indefinable opposite to my parents' beliefs. But when I finally got around to watching it, it was the same. The same shaming beliefs, the same assumption of harm. Maybe it started out different, and maybe if it hadn't been condemned by churches and attacked by politicians, it could have stayed that way. But we'll never know, because the show got bullied into falling in line. And it sucks, and it makes me angry, because I grew up during this show, and I needed better messages about sex. What was available to me at the time hurt me, and I'm sure I wasn't alone. The kinds of restrictions my parents put on what I could watch, the kinds of messages they fed me about sex were extremely common at the time. I needed what 90210 was in season 1, and what it became in season 2 was why I needed it.